Welcome to today's video. Now I want to be thinking about vitamin D again today because autumn has come in the Northern Hemisphere now. If you live in the southern parts of the United States it might not be so bad, but up here in the higher latitudes we're just not making any vitamin D outside in the sunshine, and the vitamin D levels all over Northern Europe and the Northern United States especially will be dropping as we speak, and we know those levels are already low. Now I've got a little bit of hope today because the vitamin D story that we've been talking about since January or February on this channel is now just starting to filter into the popular press. So I want to look at some popular press reports on this, see what it's saying, see if we agree with it, and I think you might find that we do agree with it. And then we've got a little more science to look at, but don't be put off by that. We'll explain everything as we go through. So starting off with the popular press reports. Now this one's from the Telegraph, but it's in other outlets. Correcting Britain's vitamin D deficiency could save thousands of lives. So here we were having acknowledgement in the popular press that correcting vitamin D deficiency, which is highly prevalent in the United States, all over Europe, in the United Kingdom, correcting that could potentially save thousands of lives because we've got a difficult winter coming up. We know we've got a difficult winter. COVID-19 and other respiratory viruses, cases are increasing. So this article says there's one chemical that, now if it's in italics that means it's a direct quote. So this chemical is apparently known to be safe. Known to be needed by many people anyway. Well, I would say all people. Needed by all people, of course it's all people. Known to have a clinical proven track record of helping people fight off respiratory diseases. Well, yes, viral respiratory infections are combated, or the infectious viral diseases become more severe if vitamin D is lacking. This chemical is so cheap that no big firm is pushing it, and of course it's vitamin D. Now I think that this has probably got to the crux of the matter. The crux of the matter here could well be there's no money in this. You know, why should I bother doing a lot of work to help you if I don't make any money out of it? It's kind of, unfortunately, a common attitude, especially in business. So vitamin D is dirt cheap to make. We can make it for virtually nothing, make it in huge amounts, so not patented. So basically there's no money in it, just a vitamin supplement. So why bother? And I think this is why industry is not pushing it. What is concerning is that the governments around the world have not taken this up. And that concerns me because it raises the possibility, and this is outside the scope of this channel, but it raises the possibility that government thinking could be influenced by business thinking, rather than necessarily the purely public health agenda that you and me are interested in if you're watching this video. So there you go. It says all those things about it. Now, it also talks about some papers as it goes through this article. So I've obviously gone back to the original sources to see what it's saying. Vitamin D levels appear to play a role in COVID-19 mortality rates. Now this is Northwestern universities in the States. Now these researchers, they took data from China, France, Germany, Italy, Iran, South Korea, Spain, Switzerland, the United Kingdom and the United States. So they're taking data from all over the place here. Participants with severe deficiency are twice as likely to experience major complications. Is again a direct quote from these publications. This one here is the discussion paper. This one here is the primary scientific data. Don't take my word for it, it's all there. This is all based on published scientific evidence, which is hopefully what we're all about. This is not my opinion. My opinion is as irrelevant as your opinion. We have to go by the evidence. And speaking of evidence, we did this in detail recently on this channel. Spanish clinical trial giving this substance here calcifidiol. Calcifidiol. Apologies, calcifidiol. So this calcifidiol, what it is, it's the substance that, when you take vitamin D3, it's actually the active substance that the body actually uses is this calcifidiol. It's mostly converted in the kidneys. So giving this is just the same as giving vitamin D, but it works quicker. That's all it is. So basically that's a form of vitamin D that works quickly. You can call that fast-acting vitamin D, and that would be accurate. So calcifidiol, 2% required admission to intensive care. Control group, 50% required admission to intensive care. This is trial data based on small numbers, but remarkably significant data. Now, back to the article in the Telegraph, for example. Oh, I forgot to mention the article in the Telegraph is written by David Davis. Now, David Davis, MP, Member of Parliament, well-known politician in the UK. So that was encouraging. I think Matt Ridley's a journalist. So good to see that politicians and journalists are getting their act together. So David Davis at the moment, I don't think he's in government. I think he somewhat fell out of favour, but he's a famous politician, so you'll be able to talk to the right people, and let's hope he's doing so. So back to the Telegraph, written by these two guys, this article. Put another way, the use of vitamin D reduces a patient's risk of needing intensive care 25-fold. If I said to you, do you want me to reduce your chances of going to intensive care by a factor of 25? I think I know what your answer would be. I certainly know what my answer would be. The government should act now on this latest evidence, according to this article. I would change that to say governments around the world should act now. So that is that view in the mainstream media. Now, also, they said, what else did they say? Well, I've got a few extra things they said here. We have good reason to think that vitamin D supplement will help reduce mortality from COVID-19. We know it can reduce the incidence and severity of other acute respiratory illnesses. Pressure from influenza is going to be rising during the winter months. This will no doubt save thousands of lives in any second wave. There is now no reason not to act. So they seem convinced. I'm convinced. That's good. Now, moving on to the more scientific explanation now. I've actually been talking to the author of this article recently. Very interesting new research coming out. This one's published in the British Medical Journal. And this is what Shani is saying. She's a researcher in immunity and biochemistry. Many have T cells act against SARS coronavirus 2 epitopes. Now, the epitopes are the bit the immune system recognises as being foreign. So they're the antigens. So an epitope is basically an antigenic molecule. It's a molecule the body recognises as being foreign. But what she's saying here is, this statement is quite profound, and studies have shown this can be over 50%. That 50% or more of the population already have some immunity to SARS coronavirus 2, despite it being a novel virus. And this is called cross-immunity. Because they've been exposed to other coronaviruses and other viruses, the immunological cells they made in response to that can also recognise SARS coronavirus 2 in quite a lot of people. Interesting. So these immunological cells seem to be there in quite a lot of people, especially these T cells. So why aren't the T cells doing their job in many people? What is going on here that the T cells aren't doing their job? Because T cells kill intracellular parasites. That's what they do. And this is critical in viral immunity. Now, I think we'll just do a bit of brief background here. As you know, we have lymphocytes. The lymphocytes are these immune cells, the white blood cells, some of the white blood cells. There's big ones and the small ones. They're the two classifications, easy to remember. The big ones are the NK cells. Sounds like something out of the Terminator, but that's what we call them, natural killer cells. They will kill virally infected cells. in a somewhat non-selective way, but we're now learning that these natural killer cells are themselves learning to be specialised now. The small lymphocytes can be divided into the B and the T types of lymphocyte. They mature in the bone, they mature in the thymus gland. The B cells are the ones that actually produce the antibodies. They are the antibody factories. They churn out billions of antibodies. The T cells can be helpers that help the B cells to do this. The T cells can also be a type of T cell called a suppressor, which tells it when it's time to stop doing this. That's a positive feedback from the helper cells. That's a negative feedback from the suppressor cells. But crucially, the T cells can also be the cytotoxic cells. And the cytotoxic T cells kill virally infected cells, therefore kill all the viruses that are in those cells. So that's kind of the story of the lymphocytes that we're talking about here. And what these cytotoxic T cells do is, if there's a virally infected cell here with viral particles in it, the T cell will come alongside. That's the T cell there. It will drop poisonous chemicals on it, completely kill that cell, therefore killing all the viruses inside. Cytotoxic T cells, crucial to viral immunity. So that is the sort of background science here that's happening with these types of white blood cells. Now, so they kill intracellular parasites. Now, I've called viruses here parasites. Technically, they're not parasites, they're viral particles or virions, but you get the idea. What happens is the virus gets into the cell and it actually parasitizes the cell, really. So to say viruses are obligate intracellular parasites is actually true. They can only reproduce inside your body cells in this case. So these cells are recognised according to this article in British Medical Journal, and of course this is recognised on very well-trodden science, critical in viral immunity, of course. T cell response might be more important than the B cell response. Interesting. So this is saying that the T cell response in the case of SARS coronavirus 2 could be more important than the B cell response. Now, what do the B cells do? Well, the B cells produce the antibodies. The immunoglobulins or the immune proteins. So this article is saying that the activity of the T cells, this direct cytotoxic effect killing the virally infected cells, is probably more important than the antibodies. Interesting. Probably more important than the antibodies. So let's carry on looking at this. Again, plenty of research for you to look at here. B cell response might not be important, but is not strictly required to overcome the disease. Now, this statement here is based on work in Italy, where some patients were admitted who couldn't make antibodies and yet still recovered from the disease. Therefore, they must have recovered from the disease using other forms of immunity, such as, presumably, the T cell, cytotoxic T cell response, because the B cells weren't working, they couldn't make antibodies. They had a genetic disease that means they couldn't produce antibodies, yet they got better from this virus. So if you get infected, yeah, the antibodies are probably going to do something, but the T cells are as well. And the T cells, at least in these particular instances, were enough to allow the patients to recover without antibodies. And the problem is vaccines are focused on antibody levels because it's easy to measure. Now, milder asymptomatic cases, many T cells are produced. So what this line of thinking is saying is that if someone has mild disease or asymptomatic disease, the reason for that is they produce lots of T cells quickly that eradicate the virus very quickly. People that have high levels of antibodies, it's because the T cells haven't been activated quickly enough. So people with more severe disease tend to have high levels of antibodies, where people with less severe disease have higher levels of T cells, indicating the T cells have got rid of the infection virtually straight away, and in 20% of people before they even get clinical symptoms. Such as the powerful effect of the T cell immunological response. Quite an impressive immune system you and I have. So in mild cases, few or no detectable antibodies. Interesting. The T cells did the job. And yet the vaccine seemed to be largely focusing on the antibodies. Although not entirely, T cells are, vaccine manufacturers are looking, vaccine trials are looking at T cells as well. Men produce fewer T cells than women. Well, that could explain something, couldn't it? Older men produce less T cells than younger men. That could explain something as well, because we know men are at higher risk and we know that older men are at higher risk. Right, we're going to get back to vitamin D in a minute, but this is all very interesting. Now, this paper here, vitamin D controls T cell antigen receptor signaling and activation of human T cells. It's all very complicated stuff. What this means basically is vitamin D is necessary for T cell receptor signal activation. In other words, the T cells will be sitting there doing nothing unless they're activated by vitamin D. In T cells, there are vitamin D receptors. If the T cell cannot interact with the vitamin D receptor, the T cell cannot function normally and provide its an immunological, physiological function. So vitamin D, essential to facilitate maturation of naive T cells to dedicated specific T cells. So what happens here is we have T cells, and before they are exposed to a particular antigen, in this case SARS coronavirus 2, they are naive, they are relatively unspecialized, relatively. But then when they're exposed to the antigen, that causes cell division, and they become more and more specialized for that particular type of antigen. So they change from kind of raw recruits, if you like, naive T cells, into specific viral killing dedicated cells. They are specific. This is an acquired specific immune response, which is the nature, of course, of acquired specific immunity. Now, this is the critical bit. When a T cell is exposed to a foreign pathogen, in this case the virus, a pathogen, anything that can cause disease, it extends a vitamin D receptor to search for vitamin D. So it seems like the T cell, when it's exposed to an antigen, puts its hand out, as it were, to get vitamin D. And if it doesn't get vitamin D, it doesn't work, indicating that that vitamin D is essential for some immunological biochemical pathways within the T cell that will activate it, bringing it into, making it become a mature T cell. It can't grow up without it. Just like children can't grow up without protein, T cells can't grow up without vitamin D. It's essential to their biochemistry. These vitamin D receptors are in all of these T cells. If there's an adequate amount, this paper says, this work is from Denmark, Copenhagen. Read it for yourself. Read it for yourself. It's all there. Very convincing science. If there's an inadequate amount of vitamin D, they won't even begin to mobilize. So vitamin D levels, low vitamin D levels means low activation of T cells. And we know that people get the mildest disease have the highest activation of T cells. All fits in. Now, going back to the paper in the BMJ, vitamin D is also essential for normal mucosal defences, the mucous membranes in the nose or the mouth. What happens? It actually, if there's little gaps between the cells there in the nose and the mouth, the vitamin D tightens those junctions up. And I think it probably has effect on the production of immunoglobulin type A's, which are the type of antibodies found in the mucus. So that mucus in your nose and your mouth is stuffed full of antibodies. You don't see it, but they are there, doing all sorts of immunological functions. The immune system is just an amazing thing. So physiological mucosal defences, all the other immune cells, and modulating cytokines. So vitamin D can up-regulate cytokine activity to bring about inflammation. It can down-regulate cytokine activity to prevent excessive inflammatory changes, such as those that make the alveoli fill up with fluid in acute respiratory distress syndrome. This all fits together. Problems that are identified: obesity, diabetes, black, Asian minority groups who produce vitamin D more slowly, male sex, elderly people and people that live in cities, all at increased risk from severe COVID disease, all associated with lower levels of vitamin D. And just to give another really good association example, Japan, low death rate from COVID-19. The community health measures in Japan have been rather poor, to be quite honest, and yet the death rates are low. Elderly there tend to be very active, get outside quite a bit. Also, of course, Japan has a very high fish diet. They eat a lot of fish and they eat a lot of seaweed in Japan. But the fish especially, the oily fish especially, are going to contain high amounts of vitamin D. And we talked about this with Rahul a few weeks ago, a researcher from Kerala, who found out that in the 1918 pandemic, the people that ate a lot of fish in Kerala got less severe Spanish flu back in 1918 compared to vegetarians. So that all kind of fits together with the immune response and vitamin D. So the same thing seems to be happening in Japan. Vitamin D levels are over 30 nanograms per mil in 95% of the population, much higher, whereas in the UK average is below 20 nanograms per mil. So we can see that the vitamin D levels in Japan are on average more than a third higher than in the UK, and they appear to have the less severe death rates to demonstrate that. Right. Last paper here. The role of vitamin D deficiency in COVID-19 related deaths in black, Asian minority ethnicities, obese and other high-risk categories. So don't take my word for it, look it up. Now just to notice here, to convert to, we have two ways of measuring this, nanograms per mil and nanomoles per litre. And all you do is, if it's nanograms per mil, you just times it by 2.5. So we tend to use, this is used in the States more, we tend to use this more in the UK and Europe. But it's the same thing, it just measures the levels of active vitamin D in the blood. Right, now this paper says 20 nanograms per mil, enough to prevent rickets. Osteoporosis is loss of bone mass. Osteomalacia is bone softening. So osteoporosis, common problem, causes a lot of fracture in the elderly. Osteomalacia, especially in the young, causes softening of the bones and bending that can cause what we used to call bow legs, deformities in the bones of the legs due to lack of vitamin D in rickets. So what we're saying is that relatively low levels of vitamin D are enough to protect us against the bone effects of lack of vitamin D, but not enough to allow the immune system to work at optimum function. So the bones can work perfectly on that level of vitamin D, but to work normally the immune system needs a higher level. And what we've done traditionally is recognise the effect of lack of vitamin D on rickets, but what we haven't recognised traditionally is the effect of the lack of vitamin D on immunity. That's what needs to change, and is changing, and can save, according to the article, thousands of lives. 40 to 60 nanograms per mil is, or more, is required to achieve optimum immunity and also cancer fighting capability. That's what it says. So low vitamin D also associated with some cancers, prostate cancer, for example. So 30 nanograms per mil is sufficient but not optimal. Now this is interesting, the Maasai. Now the Maasai are, basically the Maasai are, the traditional Maasai lifestyle is pastoralists. They're herders. They live mostly with and from their cattle. and they are outside a lot of the time tending their cattle. And their blood levels of vitamin D, despite being very dark skinned, but because they're outside, because they live near the equator, 40 to 60 nanograms per mil. Now, if they're exposed to more sun, the levels don't keep going up. So exposure to too much sun isn't going to cause too much vitamin D. But exposure to not enough sun is going to reduce the amounts of vitamin D. But interesting, so the Maasai are kind of closest to what we might call a natural human environment. They live in Africa where our ancestors come from, and that is their blood levels of vitamin D. So, So, given that we're not making vitamin D from the sun, that leaves food supplementation, as is done in quite a few Nordic areas. Supplements in the UK are generally available. It's a bit confusing. 400 international units is the same as 10 micrograms. It's a pity it's done in two different units, but 800 international units, 20. 1,025 micrograms, 2,050 micrograms, which I take. 4,000 is 100 micrograms, but I also get quite a bit of sun exposure. And of course, we believe that Dr. Fauci is taking 6,000, which is 150 micrograms. The official levels recommended in the States and the UK, according to data we've just looked at, do not generate adequate optimum serum levels according to the data that we've looked at. So the recommendations for vitamin D in the United States and the United Kingdom, given the evidence we've looked at, will not bring the blood levels of vitamin D up high enough, according to this data, to establish optimum immune function. As the article said, it's time for governments to act on this. And it does need to be it does need to be governments to act, because there is not the financial incentive for companies to act, because this stuff is so cheap, low-hanging fruit. Okay, thank you for listening. Let's hope we can report on this soon and say the government have issued new guidelines.